This is a full-scale, long-form cinematic narrative designed as a three-part audiobook-style documentary experience. The prose is characterized by its expansive, flowing sentence structures, atmospheric pacing, and a deep dive into the psychological and historical stakes of the conflict. The Sterling Debt, Blood, Water, and Beyond Part 1. The Ghosts of 1874. Midnight to 1500 hours. There is a specific, heavy quality to the silence that hangs over Emerald Basin at 5 o'clock in the morning. A silence that doesn't just signify the absence of noise, but rather the presence of a century-old peace, a peace I have guarded with the quiet ferocity of a man who knows that every inch of this soil was paid for in the currency of sweat and stubbornness. I was standing on the porch of the home my father built, watching the first translucent ribbons of mist curl off the surface of the water like the ghostly fingers of the men who came before me. When the tranquility was violently pierced by the rhythmic, strobe-like flash of blue and red police lights reflecting off the dark water like a jagged neon scar across the history of Blackwood County. My son, Caleb, was standing at the end of the old wooden dock, his silhouette a steady, unmoving anchor against the chaotic flickering of the patrol car, and for a fleeting second, I felt that ancient, familiar burn of protective rage rising in my throat, the kind of heat that comes when you see the modern world trying to sink its teeth into your family sanctuary. But as I watched the two officers step out of their vehicle, their boots crunching on the gravel that Silas Sterling himself had laid down in the late 19th century, I remembered that Caleb wasn't just a boy with a fishing rod anymore. He was a man who had recently returned from the capital with a silver badge tucked into his belt and the heavy, legal mandate of the chief wildlife conservator resting on his shoulders. You see, the people who live in the manicured, gated vacuum of the Sovereign Heights HOA, a development of beige stucco and hollow promises that crawled over our borders 10 years ago, look at our land and see an eyesore and non-conforming relic of a bygone era that they believe should be assimilated into their collective aesthetic. They see Emerald Basin as a shared community amenity, a picturesque backdrop for their morning jogs, but they have no memory of the year 1874, when my great-grandfather, Silas, arrived here with nothing but a shovel, a team of weary oxen, and a vision that could see a sprawling oasis where everyone else saw a dust bowl. He spent 3 brutal years of his life literally carving Sterling Pond out of the unforgiving earth with his own 2 hands, creating a reservoir that saved this entire valley during the Great Drought, a deed that earned our family the irrevocable riparian water rights, a legal shield that was forged long before the ancestors of the current HOA board had even set foot on this continent. The catalyst for this morning's intrusion was a woman named Beatrice, a woman whose face was permanently etched with the sour scowl of someone who has mistaken her position on a neighborhood board for a seat on the Supreme Court. She was standing behind the officers, her arms crossed over a designer tracksuit, her voice a shrill, piercing intrusion that shattered the dawn as she demanded that my son be arrested for illegal poaching and trespassing on community-managed water. "This is a private residential zone," she shrieked, her finger pointing at the water as if she could command the tides themselves. "We have ordinances, we have rules, and the Sterling family is not exempt from the standards of Sovereign Heights just because you've been squatting here since the Stone Age." I stepped off the porch, the weight of 100 years of history behind every footfall, but I didn't need to speak because Caleb simply turned around with a slow, deliberate calmness that made the air in the clearing feel suddenly pressurized. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't offer a frantic defense. He merely reached into his pocket, flipped open a black leather wallet, and let the rising sun catch the polished gold of the chief wildlife conservator badge. The officers, men who actually knew the hierarchy of the land, froze mid-stride, their hands moving away from their utility belts as they realized that the man they had been called to evict was actually the highest-ranking wildlife authority in the county, a man who possessed the power to shut down their entire precinct's access to the lake if he found so much as a drop of motor oil in the water. Beatrice started to stammer, her face turning a vibrant, toxic shade of violet as the reality of the situation began to settle into her bones. But she wasn't backing down yet. In her mind, the HOA was the law, and she was about to find out that history has a very long, very sharp memory. The conflict didn't end with the morning mist. It merely retreated into the shadows of boardrooms and legal offices, fermenting into a cold, calculated war of paper and ink as the Sovereign Heights HOA attempted to do with bureaucracy what they couldn't do with a patrol car. A few days later, a fleet of 3 identical black SUVs rolled onto our property like a funeral procession for the ego, and out stepped President Dalton, a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that produced middle managers and expensive, meaningless suits, with Beatrice trailing behind him like a vengeful shadow. They didn't come to negotiate. They came to deliver a decree, a formal notice of abatement and remediation that demanded the immediate dismantling of our ancestral dock, the cessation of all fishing activities, and a staggering list of fines for aesthetic violations that totaled more than the original cost of the land itself. Dalton spoke in a smooth, rehearsed tone about community harmony and unified ecological management, as if he were trying to convince me that the water my great-grandfather bled for was now a shared asset to be managed by a committee of people who couldn't tell a largemouth bass from a garden hose. "We want to be neighbors, Sterling," Dalton said, his eyes scanning our home with a mixture of pity and predatory intent. "But Sovereign Heights is a brand. It's an experience, and this unpermitted structure on the water is a liability for our insurance and a blemish on our shared resource. So we are giving you 7 days to comply before we bring in the county bulldozers to restore the natural shoreline." I watched Caleb, who was leaning against the porch railing with a notebook in his hand, his eyes tracking every movement of the HOA members with the clinical detachment of a hunter watching a trapped animal. "You talk about natural shorelines, Dalton," Caleb said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant register that seemed to vibrate the very air between them. "But if you had bothered to check the 1874 land grant file with the Blackwood County Surveyor, you'd realize that this shoreline was artificially constructed by my family to prevent the very erosion that your poorly designed storm drains are currently causing to this ecosystem." Caleb stepped forward, pulling a certified document from his folder, his badge gleaming with a quiet, lethal authority. "As the Chief Wildlife Conservator, I have officially designated Emerald Basin as a primary ecological monitoring site, which means that under State Statute 12C, any attempt to modify this shoreline or remove these structures by an unauthorized third party, meaning you and your board, will be treated as a criminal act of environmental sabotage against a protected state resource." The arrogance on Dalton's face didn't just fade. It evaporated, replaced by a flickering look of genuine panic as he realized that he wasn't just bullying a local squatter, but was instead threatening a state official on protected ground. Beatrice, however, was too blinded by her own self-importance to see the cliff they were walking toward, and she began frantically taking photos of our home, shouting about filing reports and contacting the governor. Her frantic energy a sharp contrast to the silent, immovable presence of the land she was trying to steal. We spent the following week in the dim, dust-choked basements of the county records office, pulling up brittle, yellowed maps and hand-signed deeds that proved our family's ownership was as irrevocable as the tides, while Beatrice continued her campaign of harassment, calling the fire marshal, the health department, and even the animal control office in a desperate, flailing attempt to find a single crack in our armor. But every official who arrived at our gate left with the same result: a respectful nod to Caleb's badge and a firm warning to the HOA that they were playing a very dangerous game with the wrong family. The tension finally reached its atmospheric breaking point on a Tuesday night, inside the opulent, marble-floored clubhouse of Sovereign Heights, a room that smelled of expensive air conditioning and the quiet desperation of people who believe that their net worth is a substitute for character. The board had called an emergency community adjudication, a public trial disguised as a town hall meeting, where they intended to humiliate the Sterling family in front of the neighborhood and vote on a formal eminent domain seizure of the waterfront. The room was packed with residents, many of whom looked bored or confused, while Beatrice sat at the center of the dais like a grand inquisitor, her gavel poised to deliver a blow that she believed would finally erase us from her peripheral vision. When Caleb and I walked in, the room went silent. 100 pairs of eyes tracking us as we took our seats in the front row, our presence a stark, rugged contrast to the polished artifice of the clubhouse. Dalton began the meeting with a long-winded speech about progress and the common good, painting us as stubborn obstacles to the community's future, while Beatrice chimed in with testimonies of our supposed environmental neglect and illegal activities. But when it was our turn to speak, Caleb didn't walk to the podium. He walked to the projector, and instead of a speech, he presented a century's worth of legal reality that hit the room like a physical weight. He projected the 1874 deed, the ink of great-grandfather Silas's signature still clear and defiant after 150 years, and he showed the state water rights certification that explicitly stated the HOA had no legal claim to the surface or the bed of Emerald Basin. He showed the recent Wildlife Department survey that proved the HOA's own runoff was the primary source of pollution in the area, and he read a formal letter from the state attorney general that warned the HOA board of personal criminal liability if they continued their harassment of a state conservator. The murmur of the crowd changed from hostile to horrified as they realized that their board members had lied to them, dragging the entire neighborhood into a frivolous, unwinnable legal battle that threatened to bankrupt the association's insurance reserves. Dalton looked like he wanted to vanish through the floorboards, while Beatrice sat frozen, her gavel still raised, but her power completely shattered by the quiet, unyielding weight of the truth. The Sterlings were here before the first brick of this clubhouse was laid, Caleb said, his voice filling the room without the need for a microphone. And we will be here long after the beige paint on your houses has faded away, because we don't just own this land, we are a part of it, and the law of this state recognizes that history cannot be erased by an ordinance or an ego. The meeting ended in a chaotic retreat for the board, as neighbors began shouting for Dalton's resignation, and Beatrice fled out the side door to avoid the cameras and the questions. A week later, she attempted one final, desperate act of malice, calling the county sheriff to report a violent disturbance at our home, hoping to trigger a tactical raid that would finally give her the victory she craved. But when the sheriff arrived and saw us peacefully fishing on the dock, he didn't arrest us. He went straight to Beatrice's front door and served her with a criminal summons for filing a false police report and stalking. Today, the silence has returned to Emerald Basin, a deeper, more permanent silence that is no longer threatened by the shrill voices of the entitled or the hollow threats of the ignorant. Beatrice has moved away, her house sold at a loss to a family that actually appreciates the sight of an old wooden dock, and the HOA has signed a formal no-contest agreement that legally acknowledges our family's sovereign rights to the water forever. As the sun sets over the dock that Silas built, casting a long, golden bridge across the water that has seen our family through droughts and wars and the slow crawl of time, I realize that true power doesn't come from a title or a shout. It comes from the truth, it comes from a law, and it comes from the quiet strength of knowing that you are standing on the shoulders of giants who never, ever back down from a fight. The Sterlings are still there, the last sentinels of a bygone era, proving that legacy isn't something you buy, it's something you protect with every breath in your body. Justice wasn't just served at Emerald Basin. It was reinforced, etched into the county's history so deeply that no amount of beige stucco will ever be able to cover it up. This story brings us to the heart of the modern American struggle between the new world of committees and the old world of individual legacy. The question of authority. Did Caleb use his position as chief wildlife conservator as a fair shield to protect his family's history? Or was it a convenient badge-heavy maneuver that bypassed the normal channels of neighborly dispute? The HOA dilemma. In an age where nearly 30% of Americans live under an HOA, how much power should these private associations truly have over land and history that predates them? Is the greater good of a community aesthetic worth the erasure of individual family heritage? The standing of truth. If the Sterlings hadn't possessed the silver bullet of a 150-year-old water right and a high-ranking badge, would the HOA have been morally right to demand conformity? Or is there an inherent value in the non-conforming that we are losing in our quest for suburban perfection? What would you do? Would you have the composure to let the law speak for you? Or would you have fought fire with fire the moment they stepped on your dock? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe that history should never be for sale, hit that subscribe button to help us keep these cinematic stories alive.